Second half of Chapter 7, and this is going to talk about documentation. We're going to touch on some topics in this section that we're going to do in a lot more detail over the coming weeks. We're going to touch them here just to introduce them. It's an important topic. So if you remember in the systems development cycle, there is the phase called systems analysis. The output of that phase is often something called a narrative. A narrative, which is just paragraph form words explaining how the system might work in narrative format, like a book. That would be very, very difficult to do anything with. So you need some means of documentation that takes that narrative and converts it to a form that in very few words describes how things will work. And that's what system documentation is all about. We will talk about 6 documentation types. There may be others in the text. I'm going to focus on these 6. The 2 in red at the end will be your deliverable from the first phase of your project. Okay? You're not going to learn enough in Chapter 7 to be ready to do that. I believe that's Chapter 8 where you get it, but we'll touch on it in Chapter 7. These other 4 are very useful documentation styles. We've actually seen process maps as part of 7a, and we'll talk about the others as well. System flowcharts were very popular in kind of the older way of implementing computer systems. So why is documentation important? It's a standard form of communications. Anybody should be able to read documentation that is done in the proper format and understand what it's saying. 2, it allows you to do your design work from it. It's used for training purposes. It helps you to control costs, because if you document well, then your programmers will know what they should program. If you document well, the tester should know what the program should have done. And so good documentation will be a cost control mechanism. Auditors, if you're going to be an internal auditor, you use that documentation as a basis for understanding whether the systems are doing what they say they were going to do. And accountability. Because you have, particularly on Monday, we talked about the idea of outsourcing. If you didn't have very strong documentation, when you sent work over to India for somebody else to do programming, how are they going to know what to program? But with good documentation, they're accountable for delivering what you told them to deliver. So it enforces accountability, not only in that case, that's kind of the severe case, but even internally, it ensures that people do what they're supposed to have done or pay the price. So documentation has a series of symbols and words and lines, and that's really what documentation is. This would be a process map for employee reimbursement. So let's talk about process maps first. The nice thing about process maps is they don't have too many different symbols. 5 of them. It has a start or finish box. It has a task box. It has a decision point, direction of flow, and then a connector. This connector is used in case you can't fit it all on one page. You'd have a line going into a circle that has an A on it. That's an A. It's kind of small. And then on the next page, you'd have an A with a line coming out of it saying it comes from that point. It's a way of connecting 2 pages to each other. Sometimes that is a hexagon, looks like home plate. You might see it in that form too. So here's a process map. And this is how a picture, what's that saying? A picture says 1,000 words or something? A picture with what? 30 words on it max, 20 words on it max, tells a story. And this is the order fulfillment process. It's very simple. Notice this is the first level. You don't want to put too much detail on a single page because it can be complicated and then not that useful. So you have a relatively high-level picture. In today's day and age, if you did this in an automated fashion, you might click on this submit order box and see a next level of detail related to what it takes to submit an order. Notice along the left-hand side, we have the various user communities involved in the system. You might see this along the top. It doesn't matter. There are six of one, half dozen of the other. So in words, this would say a customer orders some goods. They do that from the sales department. The sales department gets that order and submits it to credit and billing. Credit and billing checks the customer's credit to make sure they're a viable customer. Is that credit okay? Notice at the highest level, we don't show the no branch. That's exception processing. We don't show the exception processing at that highest level. So if the credit is okay, the order goes to shipping, to the shipping department. The shipping department checks to make sure there's inventory for that order. If there is inventory on hand, you pick the goods, and then you ship the goods. If there's not, again, this is exception processing. You don't show it here. The shipping department, once they pick the goods, the invoice goes to the billing department, which happens in this company to be the same department as credit. And that bill goes directly to the customer. The sales department is not involved in the billing. So the picture tells that story. Okay? Here's another one. Oh, no. Second level. So submit order. This is the second level for credit. Is the customer approved for credit at all? Does the customer is their account up to date, meaning have they paid up to date? Is the amount of this order within the credit limit? If all three of those things are okay, you approve it for shipping. If any of them are not okay, you reject the order. You tell the sales department, who will then have to tell the customer that it was rejected. So notice here, the second level is where we're going to show that exception processing, the reject order. The various stakeholding users are along the top. You could have done it along the left side. It would have just been turned sideways. Okay? So those are process maps. And we saw the process maps as it related to the systems development lifecycle. Similar idea, except not restaurant stuff. That's a process map. A system flowchart, the second type of documentation. This is more technical in nature. This is something that a detailed design analyst, somebody with some technical skills, would deliver to a programming unit to say how things are going to work. Notice there are a bunch of different symbols. I think if I go to the next page, there are even more than this. There are, 14 or 15 symbols here. Of them, there are probably 4 different ways of just a data store. You have a magnetic tape, online data, magnetic disk, direct storage. They're all really the same thing in my book. They're all just data stores. But a tape is a little bit different because that might be for backup purposes. And this is a file down there. So there are a lot more symbols in this, to be honest. When I was a young developer, we have this like plastic template, and you take a pencil and you'd have holes cut out, and you draw these things. They're real. I mean, we used to do that. It was before you could do it. I think all of these are on Excel now, or the ones that are still relevant. So here's a process where that thing on top looks like a document. That's what it is. That's a symbol for a document. So a time card or a time sheet is a type of document in this world. This is meant to be a keyboard. So it's typed into a keyboard by some data entry clerk. There's a process here which is processing the payroll using reference table, well, using a tax table as a reference table and the employee's master database as inputs. Coming out of it become the transactions, the payroll transactions, and then there would be another process where you actually print the checks and summaries. So you'd actually have the checks here and the summaries here, and an error report would be printed for anything that was a mistake. Okay? So that is a system flowchart, and it would describe the overall system or subsystem. And then this would probably be a program, and this would be a program in here, where a programmer would then get more detailed advice on how to do that. Okay, so flowcharts, whether it's a process map or a systems flowchart, a couple of guidelines here. You read from top to bottom and left to right, wherever possible. If you remember the restaurant one, you kind of went this way and then that way. Sometimes you can't exactly do that exactly as you want. But top to bottom, left to right, left to right. Anybody know why you do that? That's how people read, kind of like this. If you ever notice, most of the time, if you ever see a company's advertisement, their logo is going to be down here, because they know that your eye scans in this direction, and they want to get their logo at you at the end. Now, some of them put it somewhere else because they're trying to force you around, but that's the kind of the natural reading style. So, top to bottom, left to right. Use the symbols. If you have an input and an output, there has to be a process in between. An input can't just, you can't have an input that results in an output without some process box in between. And this is true in a lot of cases. It's called the sandwich rule. It's got to be some meat in the sandwich for it to be a sandwich. Otherwise, it's just two pieces of bread. A bread sandwich. So you need that process. That's the meat in your sandwich. Okay, so that's some rules. The third type of documentation is called a program flowchart. Now we're getting into detailed documentation that a programmer might use. Telling the programmer exactly what he or she needs to do to write their program. And this program flowchart, and again, using symbols, starts and ends, decisions, automated processes, etc. This is the process of counting. You have a control total. It's set to 0 to start. You read a record. This is a file with many, many records. It's going to be a batch process. You compute the sales amount, which is the price times the quantity. You add the sales amount to the control total. So initially it's 0. So the first record, whatever the sales amount is, that's the number you have. You print out an output line for that sales amount. Is there another account? No. You go back up here. Notice you go up below the 0, which means you now read the second record. You're going to compute the price times quantity. It becomes its own line, but it also gets added to the previous one. So you now have the control total, which will be at the bottom of the report, the total field. So not only you're printing out each line, but you're calculating for a total field at the end. And so when you get to the last account, there's no more records after it. You then print that control total, the final total, at the bottom of the report, and you're done. So that's how a program flowchart works. A decision table. Whoops. This is a logic chart for a programmer. Remember, the central processing unit does calculations. That's what the previous one does. And it performs logic. So this is some simple logic. And this is a decision table. Let's see if we can figure this out together. OK, this first rule right here, first condition. Account balance is less than $5. If BAL is less than $5. That's where we're starting. The action for that is pay no interest. Then interest is equal to 0%. Else, if their balance is less than 1,000, what happens?
You pay 5% interest.
Pay 5% interest. Now you're onto a totally different set of logic here. Else, so now you have only the situation where it's 1,000 or more. But you don't have to write that down because that covers everything else. Else, if account less than 1 year, what happens? Pay 5% again. So this is if your balance is greater than 1,000, but it's a new account, then interest is equal to 5%. And you finish it off with everything else. This last category is everything else that could happen. What happens? Else interest is equal to 5.5%. Wouldn't that be nice if we got interest at a bank for 5.5%? Those were the days. OK? So you could have a document that looks like this that results in a set of code that could look something like this, a logical code. So you can convert, a programmer can convert this into code. Decision table. Good? So we just relatively quickly went through 4 different types of documentation, all leading up to the 2 that we really care about. First, a data flow diagram, DFD. Everyone in this room will learn how to do a DFD. There are 3 kinds of DFDs. Context, which is really a context level DFD. It's the highest level. And then you can have a logical or a physical DFD. We will be working with logical DFDs. I'll just teach you quickly the physical DFDs here today as well. But we will be doing logical DFDs. Nice thing about DFDs, you only have to remember 4 symbols. 4. A box or a rectangle is an external entity, some entity that's interacting with the system. You have a line. Now, because it's a modern world, our lines in data flow diagram are curved. Doesn't matter. A circle is an entity, an internal entity for a physical DFD or a process for a logical DFD. And we'll see what that means on the next couple of slides. And you can use either one of these symbols, I don't care, to represent data stores. And sometimes one is temporary, the other is permanent. Doesn't matter to me. This is just either one. People usually use this one above, to represent a data store, a database of some kind. 4 symbols. The context diagram. This is the highest level. So if you have a system, the entire system is a single circle, one process, and it just looks at which are the entities external to that system that will be interacting with that system. And in a very, very high level, what is the information flow between that system and the external entities? So timekeeping is an external entity, and that is to submit time card information. HR is an external entity to provide any changes that are going on to the payroll information, because this is a payroll processing system. Employees receive their paychecks from the system, so they're external to it. Management gets some kind of a summary. And government agencies get the information that government agencies get about pay for 4Ks or whatever, 1099s or whatever are being produced. So that is the context level. One process. One. Second, we'll talk about the physical data flow diagram. Physical. This does, after the context level, this does not show more processes. It shows the people inside the organization who are interacting explicitly with the system at the second level. Remember, the context level is the very top level. So who's interacting with it at the second level? And it shows it by job title. And it talks about tangible documents. So this would be a second level, or what's really called a level 1 physical DFD. Notice that there are 3 circles. Each one has a type of person. A data entry clerk, a cashier, an accountant. And then it shows the external entities that we have already seen. These are the exact same 5 that were on the context level. It shows data bases. It tells you what information is flowing. It breaks a rule here. Remember we had kind of that sandwich rule? You need to have a process between an input and output. Well, you should never have one data talking to another data. The reason you could break that rule in a physical data flow diagram, because this is all done in a computer, and there's no human entity between them. Right? It's not a process that would. There is a process between them normally, but in this case, there's no human entity between them, so it's not really breaking the rule. It's because these are not processes. But when you do logical data flow diagrams, this would be a no-no. Okay, so this is what a physical data flow diagram looks like. And this would be a level 1. And if you needed more information about what the data entry clerk does, or if there are different types of clerks, you go down level 2, level 3, level 4, until you've got it. Logical. This is what we'll be doing. Instead of emphasizing the people who do stuff, it emphasizes what gets done. So each circle is a task, an activity, a process, whatever you want to call it. And it could look something like this. Notice the same 5 external entities. Now there are 4 sub-processes. The whole thing is process payroll. Now to process payroll, the first step is process the hours worked. Second step is process any changes to the payroll information. Third is produce the paychecks. And the last one is produce reports. And each one of these could then be decomposed into more and more detail as need be. We're only looking at one master file here. I would venture to say there ought to be more than one. You should have an employee database involved. There are some other things that ought to be involved. It shows on the line exactly the information that's being passed to and from. So this is the logical data flow diagram. And as I said, you can decompose it. So let's decompose. Officially, this is called a level 0 logical data flow diagram, because you have that 0 there. We'll decompose process paychecks to level 1. And to process the paychecks, the first thing you're going to do is compute the gross pay. And then second thing you're going to do is compute any deductions. And there are a lot of them. The third thing you would do then is compute the net pay. Fourth, you would then prepare the paychecks. And that would go to the employee. Okay? And now, compute net pay, which is the level 1, could have a level 2 below it. Or, well, computing payroll deductions could have an easy one. There are lots and lots of different deductions, right? Taxes, insurance, whatever they might be. So you have to compute a lot of different things in there. So you would undoubtedly break this one down into further detail to describe the various types of deductions that you would have in computing your payroll. Some guidelines for DFDs. Make it detail appropriate. Your context level, one circle, external entities, nothing else. No data stores, no nothing. And then you keep decomposing. You know you've done too much if you have more than 7 processes. It's not a hard and fast rule, but approximately 7 processes, 7 circles at any level of a logical data flow diagram is about all you want to have. Beyond that, it's just too complicated for a single diagram. If you're showing a data flow, data should flow in and out. Almost always, sometimes you'll just have data flowing out if it's a reference data, if it's a reference database. But in almost all cases, data will flow in and data will flow out. And again, until you get to the greater detail, the lower detail levels, avoid the exception processing. The exception processing should go in the detail, not the highest level. That is a DFD. Everybody ready to do one now? No, we're not ready. Okay, the last type of documentation we'll talk about today, which you will also do, is something called an ER diagram. Now, the textbook makes, you'll see ERD, you'll see ER, you'll see EER. I don't care. They're all the same to me. It's just semantics. Okay? Where the data flow diagram diagrams the processes, the ER diagram shows you data relationships. When you develop a physical database, you will really drive it primarily from your ER diagram. It shows the relationship between them. That's what ER stands for, Entity Relationship Diagram, ER diagram. So you have entities, which are your databases, if you would, and how they relate to each other. The entities also have attributes. a term that we've in the past called fields. So if your entity is customer, an attribute might be customer name. And they'll have lots of attributes. Now, in accounting systems, they've developed a very specific and simplified way to do ER diagrams. It's called a relationship entity attribute, or REA model. Chang works with REA models. Cybertext works with just your basic ER diagrams. We get to bring them together. Okay? And when you do your project, I will give you the option of developing an REA model or an ER diagram. You can do whichever one's more comfortable. Cardinality. This is where we left off. A very important concept in an ER diagram is cardinality. It's the relationship between different data entities. Data entities could have a one-to-one relationship, meaning for one type of data, there's one of another. For instance, an employee would have a single personnel file. An employee most likely would have a single card, employee card. So cardinality is quite important. Other relationships might be something called one-to-many relationships. A supervisor will have many employees working for them, one-to-many, usually. And then you might have a many-to-many relationship, a true relational situation. This might be a vendor can sell many items, or a given item could be sold by many vendors. So that would be a many-to-many. And believe me, you will either get cardinality in a big way as part of this class or not. But we're going to be doing a lot more with cardinality. It's central to what you'll be doing. Okay, so here's what an ER diagram might look like. And we're not going to learn the symbology here today. This symbology that you see, these little lines and circles and these things, this is called crow's foot symbology, crow's foot. This says that a course can have many, one-to-many or zero-to-many course offerings, classes, like AIS has more than one section. But a course offering can only be for one course. A student may or may not register, but a registration has to be for a single student. So this picture is an ER diagram that shows the relationships of different entities. You'll see as we go down in this course, these diamonds are not interesting to me, and we won't need to put them in ours. It's just one less thing we have to think about. But you'll see how, for instance, an instructor can teach zero-to-many course offerings. You might be given classes, you may not. You might be given more than one class. But a course offering will only have one instructor. So that is how cardinality is displayed using symbology in an ER diagram. And of course, this is not an accounting system, so it does not use an REA diagram. Okay, this will take you back to last Thursday. When documenting systems, which pictorial method diagrams the actual flow and sequence of events? It was B, a process map. For documentation in today's day and age, there are tools out there, so you don't have to do it with a template like I used to have, a plastic template, and you had to draw off of a template. You can use Excel and PowerPoint. PowerPoint has a series of shapes for you right there, right? If you look at flowcharts, right here, it has pretty much all the shapes we talked about for flowcharting. So you can do it in PowerPoint. They have the same things in Excel. So that's kind of the low-tech way of doing it in today's world. Probably good enough for this class. What it is, the low-tech way. There are a variety of case tools which allow you to do your design. Now, the neat thing about case tools, if you use a good case tool, and I think we'll see an example in a moment, you put your design in, and it actually generates a rudimentary system from your design with screens and things like that you can use for prototyping purposes to engage the end user community very quickly in what you see the system, how you see the system working. As you can get feedback early and use that to build the real system. So when you use a case tool, it's more of a high-tech way of doing a design that leads into implementation. Whoops. And one of those case tools are Excelerator. You build essentially, this is more or less a DFD, I think, using Excelerator. Yeah, it's functions, maintain inventory, fulfill, process the order. So you create your DFD, and coming out of this DFD, you'll be able to actually develop a computer system. For your usage, Excel and PowerPoint are just fine from my perspective.